Hey kids, TC McCarthy here, author of Germline, Exogene, and Chimera. What does the Shroud of Turin have to do with lasers? Stay tuned to find out. Shroud of Turin, what is it? Well, Catholics and Christians believe that it was the burial cloth that Jesus was buried in before he was resurrected, way back in 33 AD-ish, sometime around there. But if you're a scientist, you're probably aware of carbon dating that was done on the Shroud in the 1980s. The Vatican, who holds the Shroud in the town of Turin, allowed a team of scientists to go in and do carbon dating, and the carbon dating came back and said, guess what? Medieval. I think it was 1260 to 1390 AD that they dated the Shroud to. But since then, people have kept looking at the Shroud, and a number of things have started to come out in terms of observations, scientific observations, that are starting to make people wonder if maybe that carbon dating, maybe there's a problem with it. So I'll go ahead and start with the simplest stuff that was already known around the time they did the carbon dating, and then work my way up from there. Number one, the Shroud is a photonegative, which right away makes you scratch your head and go, well, wait a second. If carbon dating is saying it's a medieval forgery, are you telling me that medieval painters knew or could conceive of a photonegative? Right away there's a problem there. And not only is it a photonegative, but it's anatomically correct. Prior to the 1980s carbon dating, they had a Swiss textile expert look at the Shroud. And as far as this expert's concerned, there's only one other place that you see that kind of textile. It's a specific herringbone weave flax textile, is in Masada, which is a fortress in Israel from the 1st century AD. In fact, that particular textile expert is convinced that linens she's seen from Masada and the Shroud of Turin came from the exact same loom. How she came to that conclusion, I don't know. Bloodstains on the Shroud match biblical descriptions of how Jesus was scourged, how he was whipped by Roman soldiers, and then later nailed to a cross and crucified with a crown of thorns on his head. In fact, if you look closely at the blood markings on his legs and back and chest, it actually matches at least one design of a Roman, what's called a Roman flagellum or a Roman flagrum, which was a specific kind of whip that had kind of dumbbell-shaped lead weights at the end. The nail marks on the Shroud are at the wrist, not the palm. And an interesting thing about placing those about piercing a human being with nails in those particular spots is that it forces the thumb to go inside the palm like that. And if you look closely at the Shroud, you'll see that, in fact, the thumbs are tucked underneath the palm. You don't see the thumbs at all. Again, this gets back to, would a medieval guy know? Well, maybe, maybe not. When light is shown through the Shroud, you don't see the image of the body from the rear. Meaning, if it's a painting, you would expect to see a shadow of the image. If you shine a light through the Shroud and look at it from the back, you'd expect to see a shadow of the image. You don't see that. In fact, it's not a painting at all, and we'll get to that later. The image of the body, whoever it is not a painting. There are blood marks on the Shroud, blood on the forehead area, at the wrist where the nails went through, and you can see droplets going down the forearms. So there's blood on the Shroud. They had it tested. It's type AB, which is, I think, 3% of the population of the world has type AB blood. If you look at the image on the Shroud, it actually kind of looks like scorch marks. The Shroud was caught in a fire, I don't know when, in medieval times. The Shroud was in a fire and they rescued it, but you can see that portions of it were scorched, and the image of the figure actually kind of resembles those scorch marks. There's just one problem with that idea. Scorch marks, when you look at them under UV light, fluoresce, but when you subject the image of the body to UV light, you can't see it at all. So it's not scorch marks. Now, when people started looking at the actual fibers, so step back for a second. The Shroud consists of threads, flax threads. Each one of those threads consists of tiny little fibers about 1/10 of the diameter of a human hair, so much smaller than a human hair. When you look at the actual fibers that make up the threads, you can see that one or two of them might be discolored, and then the next one over isn't. So it's a very small area of an actual thread that shows coloration. And the coloration is actually caused by something called, I think it's oxidative dehydration or dehydration oxidation. Basically, moisture has been sucked out of the fibers and they've been dried out in specific patterns. One of the very strange things about this image is that it actually contains three-dimensional data. NASA has a computer algorithm that will actually take a photo if it contains 3D information, it will translate that photo into a 3D image. But if you just take a regular photo of yourself that you took at the beach or whatever, it's just going to come up a muddled mess. When you subject the shroud to this algorithm, it actually comes out with a 3D image of somebody's face, meaning whoever this forger was in medieval times was pretty much kick-ass. In addition to putting 3D information in, the forger actually went out and collected somewhere around 58, I think, 58 pollen types from around the world, 28 of which happen to come from Israel, several of which are specific only to Jerusalem. That's dedication. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, you know, pollen could have come from anywhere at any time, but it's worth noting that that's the distribution on the shroud. Now, some scientists are also arguing recently that you can see the shapes of flowers on the shroud, and that those flowers and plants actually, too, those flowers and plants correspond to plants that you only find in Jerusalem. All of these plants and flowers just so happen to bloom around March and April, the time of Passover, the time of the crucifixion. They also found a specific kind of mineral dust on the shroud. I think it was called aragonite. It's a specific kind of aragonite anyway. It's supposedly a very rare limestone. I haven't actually looked into this, but supposedly it's a very rare limestone only found in Jerusalem. Now, in addition to the shroud, the Catholic Church also has something called the Sudarium of Oviedo. What's a Sudarium? Well, it's a cloth that Jews back in those days used to put over the heads of people who had died in under horrific circumstances. So, in the case of Jesus, who had been crucified and beaten and whipped, yeah, this probably would have been used for Jesus. So basically they would put a cloth over his head to sop up all the blood and make sure that that blood is buried along with the body. Now, the Catholic Church in Spain has a cloth called a Sudarium. It's in Oviedo, Spain, and freakishly enough, this cloth is almost the exact same kind of linen as the shroud. The blood type is the same blood type as that found in the shroud. When you examine the cloth closely, it is consistent with somebody who was beaten around the face and had blood and fluid from the lungs pouring out of the mouth and nose. And when you look at the pattern on the Sudarium and superimpose it on the face and the shroud, the two match up almost perfectly. I'm actually getting goosebumps with that one. And to make it even more kind of unusual, there's a dark stain on the back of the Sudarium, a little spot in an unusual shape, and it's almost identical. It's almost identical to a spot with the same shape in the same location on the shroud itself, a blood spot. Now, one of the other things that's important about the Sudarium is that it can be traced back a long way. Centuries. The Church has records on the Sudarium going back centuries prior to 1260, suggesting that the carbon dates, there could be a significant problem with them. In addition, more recently, there was a scientist from Italy called Giulio Fanti, and he is an engineer who used several different tests to get other ways to look at dates of the shroud. He tested the strength of fibers. So apparently fibers, when they age at a particular rate. I'm not exactly sure how he got this relationship. I'm assuming it was some sort of empirical relationship. He tested the fibers, and from the strength test judged that they were from 300 to 400 AD. Then he used an IR spectrometer along with a laser to look at reflectance, because apparently the age of a material will, the older a material gets, the less reflective it gets. And from that series of tests, he got an age of the shroud, looking at threads of the shroud, of I think 200 to 300 BC. And then apparently he did a third test, and when he averaged all these dates together, voila, magically he gets the date of 33 AD. I don't know if I believe those tests. I'd have to look into them in more detail, but certainly it's worth taking a look at. All right, but here's where it gets really weird, and by the way, I just mentioned lasers, so that's one place where lasers come into play with the shroud. But when you look closely at images of the shroud, images taken of the shroud, people didn't realize this at first, but you can actually see through the flesh and skin in certain locations. The hands look strange, almost like they're too long. The reason it is because you're not actually looking at just the finger section of the hand, from here up. You're actually seeing all of these bones too in the hand. Somehow those are imaged on the shroud. The other thing that people started noticing is when you look at this area of the face, it's not just mustache and lips that you're seeing, you're actually seeing teeth along with their roots. Okay, that's freaky, because what that says is that somebody in the 1300s not only painted a negative, well, they didn't paint, we know they didn't paint, but somehow in the 1300s, an individual, a forger, created an image that was a photonegative along with some characteristics that are highly suggestive of some sort of X-ray capability. That's just really odd. What it suggests is that, okay, and this is where you start getting into the realm of faith. You know, at the resurrection, at the time that Jesus died and was buried in the tomb, his body left the tomb. We know that because from accounts of Peter and I forgot the other apostle who actually showed up at the tomb, nobody was there. Only the linens were there. So it would take some kind of energy for an individual to be resurrected. When you look at other parts of the Bible, you'll see places in the New Testament where, for example, Jesus during the Transfiguration, when he went up on the mountain and he was transfigured, it describes him as almost being made of light, almost as if he had transformed into some kind of energy. When he returned after he died and was resurrected, when he returned to visit the apostles, there are places, I think, where he was described as being luminous. You know, we start getting in an area here where you're looking at this image on the shroud really being the result of some form of energy, just based on the fact that it was formed from oxidative dehydration. There's no paint there. We're looking at X-ray characteristics now. You know, you have to entertain the possibility that something kind of wacky formed the image on the shroud. And when you start thinking of wacky things, you start thinking of energy. In fact, a team of scientists, again from Italy, took a look at using a UV excimer laser to create the same characteristics that you see on the shroud, and they succeeded. What they did was just basically take a look at a small patch of the same kind of linen, and were able to discolor areas of the linen with exactly the same characteristics. Only a few fibers were changed, only one side. It dehydrated the fibers the same way you see on the shroud. You know, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean it necessarily the shroud was formed by some sort of intense UV burst of radiation, but it does suggest that's one possibility. All right, anyway, I know I'm probably losing some of you, but if you're a believer, look, I believe this is the shroud that Jesus was wrapped in, and this is the result of the resurrection. The energy released during the resurrection imprinted his image on the shroud. Now, other people out there in the community have claimed to have proven that this is a hoax by, using, rubbings, using some sort of procedure where they have a bas relief and they put a cloth over the relief and paint over that or rub over that using some sort of, iron chromate, or not iron chromate, some sort of pigment. No. Okay, yeah, you can reproduce the appearance, but you don't reproduce all the other things that I've listed out here. That's the problem. Nobody has been able to reproduce the image that we see with all the characteristics, other than using techniques like the UV laser technique. So anyway, that's it. Kind of spooky. Hope you enjoyed the video. Again, buy my books. End transmission.